The little boy's scream tore through the frozen morning air like a blade through silk. Alpha King! Alpha King! Please, Mommy can't stand up. She's on the floor and she won't move. 4-year-old Bjorn's tiny fists pounded against the carved oak doors of the great hall. His wolf pup whimpering beside him, both of them trembling not from the bitter Norwegian cold but from pure terror. Inside those doors sat King Halvard the Unbreakable, the most feared alpha in all the northern kingdoms, and this child was about to change everything he thought he knew about fate, about destiny, and about the one woman he'd sworn never to forgive. Before I tell you what happened when those doors opened, if this story has already grabbed your heart, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss a single moment of what's about to unfold, and trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless. Also, tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug. Now let's see what the Alpha King found when he opened those doors. 3 years earlier, the kingdom of Nordskog had been a place of celebration and unity. The forest stretched endlessly in green, the mountains touched the clouds, and the pack thrived under the leadership of Alpha King Halvard, a man whose very name made enemies tremble and allies bow with respect. At 30 years old, he stood 6'5", with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his entire kingdom, silver eyes that could freeze a man's blood with a single glance, and a presence that commanded every room he entered. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, only added to his imposing appearance. They called him the Unbreakable because in 23 battles, he had never fallen, never retreated, never shown mercy to those who threatened his people. But there had been one person who saw past the armor, past the reputation, past the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart. Her name was Astrid Bjornsdottir, and she had been the light to his darkness, the softness to his steel, the one person in all the realm who could make the Unbreakable King smile. Astrid wasn't like other wolves. While most female wolves in the kingdom were content to support their mates from the shadows, to raise children and tend homes, Astrid had been a healer, a scholar, and a warrior in her own right. She stood 5'8" with golden hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall of sunlight, eyes the color of amber honey, and a spirit that burned so bright it could warm even the coldest winter night. She'd grown up the daughter of a humble baker, with no noble blood, no political connections, no army to offer the king. But when she'd walked into the great hall on her 18th birthday, presenting herself as a candidate for the position of royal healer, Halvard had taken one look at her and felt something he'd never experienced before, the snap of the mate bond, instant and undeniable. The kingdom had been shocked when their warrior king chose a baker's daughter as his Luna queen. The noble families whispered and schemed, certain that this match would weaken the throne. But Astrid proved them all wrong. She transformed the healing wards, implementing new techniques she'd learned from studying ancient texts. She trained young wolves in medicine and combat, believing that every pack member should be able to defend themselves and care for others. She sat in council meetings and offered perspectives that even Halvard's oldest advisors hadn't considered. And most importantly, she loved her king with a ferocity that matched his own. For 2 years they were inseparable. Halvard would cancel meetings just to walk with Astrid through the forest. She would sneak into war councils to leave him notes that made him laugh. They would spar together in the training grounds, her quick movements and strategic mind often catching him off guard. Him holding back just enough to let her win sometimes, though she always knew and would punch his arm playfully for his condescension. At night, they would lie beneath the stars on the balcony of their chambers, her head on his chest, his fingers threading through her golden hair, and they would talk about everything and nothing. About the future of the kingdom, about whether they'd have sons or daughters first, about which of them was the better hunter, about what it meant to be truly alive. "Promise me something," Astrid had said one night, about 3 months before everything fell apart. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll remember that strength isn't just about how hard you can hit. It's about how much love you can hold in your heart and still function." Halvard had kissed her forehead, breathing in her scent of wildflowers and pine. "You make me stronger, little light. You make me believe I can be more than just a weapon for my people. You've always been more than that," she'd whispered. "You just needed someone to remind you. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. Just as Astrid discovered she was pregnant with their first child, just as the kingdom began to truly accept their unusual queen, disaster struck in the form of betrayal from within. Jarl Eirik, Halvard's own cousin and the commander of the royal guard, had been secretly planning a coup for months. He believed that Halvard had grown weak, that his love for Astrid had softened him, made him vulnerable. Eirik was a traditionalist who thought the throne should have gone to him, the one with noble blood running pure through his veins, not to Halvard, whose mother had been an outsider from the Eastern Territories. And he especially despised Astrid, viewing her as the ultimate symbol of everything wrong with Halvard's rule, a low-born woman wielding too much influence, changing too many traditions, threatening the old ways. The betrayal happened during the Festival of the Moon, when the entire kingdom gathered to celebrate the longest night of the year. Halvard had been in the center of the celebration, Astrid by his side, her pregnancy just beginning to show, both of them glowing with happiness. The attack came from everywhere at once. Eirik's loyal guards turning on their brothers, poisoned wine served to the king's most trusted advisors, fires set to trap the royal family in the Great Hall. In the chaos, Eirik made his move. He cornered Halvard in the throne room, backed by 50 armed warriors. "Your reign ends tonight, cousin," Eirik had snarled, his sword already drawn. "You've disgraced this kingdom long enough with your weak heart and your peasant queen." The battle that followed would be sung about for generations. Halvard fought like the legend he was, cutting through Eirik's men with brutal efficiency, his alpha power radiating so intensely that weaker wolves collapsed just from the pressure of it. But even the Unbreakable King couldn't be in two places at once. While he fought Eirik, the traitor's second-in-command, a vicious warrior named Dagmar went after Astrid. Astrid was in the healing ward, tending to wounded guards who had remained loyal, when Dagmar found her. Despite being 3 months pregnant, despite having no armor or weapon prepared, Astrid fought with everything she had. She'd always been faster than she looked, her healer's knowledge of anatomy making her strikes precise and devastating. She shattered Dagmar's knee, crushed his windpipe, and nearly won the fight entirely. But Dagmar had brought backup, and even Astrid couldn't fight off 5 trained warriors at once. By the time Halvard finished killing Eirik and made it to the healing ward, he found Astrid on the ground, blood pooling beneath her, Dagmar standing over her with a satisfied smirk. The king's roar of anguish shook the very foundations of the castle. He killed Dagmar so brutally that even his own loyal guards had to look away. Then he dropped to his knees beside Astrid, gathering her broken body into his arms. "No, no, no," he'd whispered, his voice cracking in a way it never had before. "Stay with me, little light. Please stay with me." Astrid's amber eyes had fluttered open, blood on her lips, her hand reaching up to touch his face. "The baby," she'd gasp. "Halvard, save the baby." "I'll save you both," he'd promised, but even as he said it, he could feel her life slipping away. The healers worked frantically, but the damage was too severe. Internal bleeding they couldn't stop, organs crushed, bones shattered. Magic could only do so much when the body was this broken. "There's a choice, my king," the head healer Solveig had said with tears streaming down her weathered face. "I can save the queen or the child, but not both. The pregnancy is too early, the strain too much. You must choose." Halvard looked down at Astrid, and she looked back at him with eyes full of love and unbearable sadness. "Save our baby," she'd whispered. "Promise me, Halvard. Let me do this one last thing. Let me give you a piece of us that will survive." "I can't lose you," he'd choked out, this mighty king reduced to a broken man in the face of impossible choice. "Astrid, please don't make me choose." "You're not choosing," she'd said, her hand squeezing his with the last of her strength. I'm choosing to save our son. I can feel it's a boy, Halvard. He's strong, so strong. He needs you to let me go so he can live." The decision Halvard made in that moment broke something fundamental inside him. He nodded to Solveig, and the healers began the emergency procedure to save the baby. As they worked, Astrid held Halvard's hand, her breathing growing shallower with each passing minute. Name him Bjorn, she'd whispered. For my father. And tell him about me. Tell him I loved him more than life itself. Tell him I chose him. I'll tell him every day, Halvard had promised, tears finally breaking through, streaming down his face. I swear it, my heart, my light, my everything. Don't become cold, Astrid had said, each word an effort now. Don't let this destroy the good man I know you are. Love our son, Halvard. Love him enough for both of us. I love you, Halvard had said desperately. Astrid, I love you so much. I know, she'd smiled, her beautiful amber eyes beginning to dim. I've always known. It's been the greatest honor of my life to be loved by you. And then she was gone. The light left her eyes, her hand went limp in his, and Astrid Bjorn's daughter, Luna Queen of Nordskog, the woman who had taught a warrior king how to love, died on the cold stone floor of her own healing ward, sacrificing herself so her child could live. The baby they saved was indeed a boy, small and premature but fighting with everything he had, just as his mother had predicted. They named him Bjorn, as Astrid had wished, and he had her golden hair and honey-colored eyes. But Halvard couldn't look at him. Every time he saw that baby, he saw Astrid dying, saw the choice he'd been forced to make, felt the gaping wound in his chest where his heart used to be. The king who emerged from that night of blood and betrayal was not the same man who had entered it. The warmth disappeared from Halvard's silver eyes, replaced by ice that never melted. He executed every last traitor with methodical brutality, then locked himself away in the throne room for 3 days, speaking to no one, eating nothing, just sitting on his throne in the dark, drowning in grief and rage. When he finally emerged, he made an announcement that shocked the entire kingdom. He was sending his newborn son away. Baby Bjorn would be raised in a remote village at the edge of the kingdom by Ragna, an elderly wolf who had once served as Halvard's own nursemaid. The king would provide financial support, but he would have no direct contact with the child. To the kingdom, he declared that this was for the boy's protection, that after the assassination attempt, the throne was too dangerous for an infant. But those closest to Halvard knew the truth. He couldn't bear to look at his son without seeing his wife's death. You're making a mistake, my king, Solveig, the head healer, had warned him. That boy needs his father. He's innocent in all this. Innocent. Halvard had laughed, a sound devoid of humor. He cost me everything. Every time I look at him, I see her dying. I see the choice she forced me to make. I see the emptiness she left behind. She didn't force you to do anything, Solveig had said sharply, showing the boldness that came with age and grief. She loved that child enough to give her life for him. And you're dishonoring her sacrifice by abandoning him. Get out, Halvard had said coldly. Before I forget the years of service you've given this kingdom and have you removed by force. So, baby Bjorn was sent away, and King Halvard transformed into a ruler even more fearsome than before. He fortified the borders, crushed any hint of rebellion with overwhelming force, and ruled with an iron fist that tolerated no weakness, no mercy, no vulnerability. He never spoke of Astrid, never acknowledged the mate bond that still ached in his chest like a knife wound that refused to heal. He took no other woman, attended no more festivals, showed no more kindness. The Unbreakable King became the Frozen King, and the kingdom that had once thrived under his balanced rule now merely survived under his tyranny. Meanwhile, in a small village called Ravndal, 3 days' journey from the capital, a little boy with golden hair and honey-colored eyes grew up not knowing his father, not understanding why he'd been sent away, not comprehending that his very existence was a source of unbearable pain for the most powerful man in the kingdom. Ragna did her best. She was a kind woman in her 60s, with silver hair and gentle hands, who had raised Halvard himself after his mother died. She told young Bjorn stories about his mother, about how brave and beautiful and brilliant Astrid had been. She showed him the few possessions that had been sent with him from the castle, a golden locket with Astrid's portrait inside, a book of healing herbs that Astrid had written herself, a blanket embroidered with wolves and stars that Astrid had been making for the nursery. Your mother loved you more than anything, Ragna would tell Bjorn as she tucked him into bed. She chose you, sweet boy. Remember that. When the time came, she chose you. But why doesn't father want me? Bjorn would ask, his honey-colored eyes filling with tears that broke Ragna's heart. Did I do something bad? No, child, Ragna would say, pulling him close. You did nothing wrong. Your father is just lost right now. Sometimes grief makes people do things that don't make sense. But it's not your fault. None of this is your fault. But children don't understand nuance. All Bjorn knew was that he'd been sent away, that his father had chosen to live in a grand castle while Bjorn lived in a tiny cottage, that the other children in the village whispered about him being the unwanted son, the reminder of tragedy, the boy the Alpha King couldn't love. Despite this, Bjorn grew into a remarkable child. He had his mother's kindness and intelligence, her quick wit and generous spirit. He helped Ragna with her healing work, learning about herbs and medicines with a natural aptitude that would have made Astrid proud. He befriended every creature in the forest, from the smallest bird to the largest deer. He stood up for other children when they were bullied, even though he was small for his age. And he dreamed constantly of the day when his father would come for him, when King Halvard would realize he'd made a mistake and bring Bjorn home to the castle where he belonged. Those dreams sustained him through the lonely years. But they were just dreams, and dreams don't keep you warm at night when you're crying yourself to sleep, wondering why your own father doesn't want you. By the time Bjorn turned 4, Ragna's health had begun to fail. She'd been old when she took on the responsibility of raising Halvard's son, and the years had not been kind to her aging body. Her hands, once so steady when mixing medicines, now shook with tremors she couldn't control. Her breathing grew labored, her steps slower, her energy depleted. But she never complained, never let Bjorn see how much she was struggling, because she loved that boy with every fiber of her being and refused to add to his burdens. The illness came on suddenly one bitter winter morning. Bjorn woke to find Ragna still in bed, which was unusual because she was always the first one up, already preparing breakfast and stoking the fire. When he padded over to her room in his bare feet, he found her pale and shivering despite the heavy furs piled on top of her. Ragna, he'd said softly, his small hand touching her forehead. Even at 4 years old, he'd learned enough about healing to know that her skin was far too hot. You're sick. Just a little cold, dear heart, she tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. I'll be better soon. But she wasn't better. Over the next week she grew worse. The fever spiked higher, the cough that rattled her chest became more persistent, and the moments of lucidity grew shorter. Bjorn did everything he could. He made the healing teas Ragna had taught him to prepare, pressed cool cloths to her forehead, and kept the fire burning constantly to keep her warm. He was 4 years old, playing healer to his dying grandmother figure, trying desperately to save the only person in the world who loved him. The other villagers helped when they could, bringing food and medicine, but everyone in Ravendel was struggling through a particularly harsh winter. Supplies were limited, and Ragna's condition required more than basic remedies. She needed the kind of advanced healing that only existed in the capital, in the royal healing ward that Astrid had once run. Bjorn, Ragna whispered one night when her breathing had become especially labored. You need to send word to the castle. Tell them I'm dying. Tell them you need help. You're not dying, Bjorn had insisted stubbornly, tears streaming down his face. I won't let you die. Sweet boy, she'd smiled sadly, her wrinkled hand cupping his cheek. Some things are beyond our control. But you mustn't be alone. Your father needs to know. He needs to take responsibility for you. He doesn't want me, Bjorn had said, his voice breaking. He sent me away, remember? He doesn't care if I'm alone. He's hurt and he's lost, but he's still your father, Ragna had said. And you're his blood. When the time comes when I'm gone, you find a way to reach him. Promise me, Bjorn. Don't let pride or fear keep you from your family. Bjorn had promised, even though he didn't believe his father would care. But he'd done it to comfort Ragna, to give her peace, because he loved her and couldn't bear to see her worried. 3 days later, on a morning when fresh snow covered the ground and the sun struggled to break through grey clouds, Ragna took her last breath. Bjorn was holding her hand, singing her a lullaby she used to sing to him, and she died peacefully, a small smile on her lips, leaving behind a 4-year-old boy who was now utterly alone in the world. The villagers helped with the burial, and the village elder, a stern man named Torsten, made arrangements to send word to the castle about Ragna's death. But winter storms made the roads impassable, and messages from remote villages to the capital were not exactly a priority. Days turned into a week, and Bjorn remained in the cottage, being watched over by neighbors who had their own families to care for, fed by villagers who could barely feed themselves. Then, exactly 8 days after Ragna died, disaster struck again. Bjorn woke in the early morning to use the privy, stumbled on his way back to bed, and fell hard, his head striking the corner of the wooden table. He went down like a stone, the impact sending shock waves through his small body. When he tried to stand up, his legs wouldn't obey. He couldn't feel them, couldn't move them, couldn't make them work no matter how hard he tried. The realization that something was seriously wrong hit him slowly at first, then all at once with the force of an avalanche. He tried to crawl but could only use his arms to drag his useless lower body across the floor. He called out for help, but the cottage was isolated, and at this early hour, no one was close enough to hear. For hours, Bjorn lay on that cold floor, crying, terrified, alone. His wolf pup, a gray and white creature named Storm that Ragna had given him for his 3rd birthday, whined and licked his face, trying desperately to comfort his young master. When the neighbor finally came to check on him around mid-morning, she found Bjorn in a state of complete panic, his legs still refusing to work, his small body trembling with cold and fear. The village healer was summoned immediately. Old Berger, a man who had learned his craft from Ragna herself, examined Bjorn with grave concern. The boy had feeling in his legs, which was good, but he couldn't move them, couldn't make them respond to his commands. The blow to his head had done something, caused some kind of damage that was beyond Berger's knowledge to fix. "He needs to go to the capital," Berger told Torsten gravely. "He needs the royal healers. This is beyond anything I can treat here." "The roads are still dangerous from the storms," Torsten said, his face troubled. "And even if we could get him there, who's to say the king would see him? Halvard sent the boy away years ago. He's made his position clear." "He's still the boy's father," Berger argued. "And Astrid's son. The late queen would haunt us all if we let her child suffer when help is available." "We'll send word again," Torsten decided. "But in the meantime, the boy stays with the village. We'll care for him as best we can." But 4-year-old Bjorn, lying in that bed with legs that wouldn't work and a heart full of fear, had heard every word. He'd heard them say that his father probably wouldn't help him even if he knew. He'd heard them say that the roads were too dangerous to make the journey. He'd heard them essentially write him off as a problem they'd deal with eventually, when it was more convenient. And something inside him broke. Not in a defeated way, but in a desperate, determined way. He remembered Ragna's words. "When I'm gone, you find a way to reach him." He'd promised her. And more than that, he realized that no one else was going to save him. If he wanted help, if he wanted his father to finally acknowledge his existence, he'd have to do it himself. Over the next 2 days, Bjorn formed a plan. It was a reckless, dangerous, probably foolish plan, but he was 4 years old, paralyzed from the waist down, orphaned and desperate. The castle was a 3-day journey by horse, impossible by foot, and completely unreachable for a child who couldn't walk. But Bjorn had Storm, his loyal wolf pup, and he had his mother's determination burning in his chest. He told the villagers he was feeling better, put on a brave face, and convinced them he'd be fine alone for a few hours while they tended to their own work. The moment he was alone, he began his impossible journey. He pulled himself out of bed using his arms, dragged himself across the floor to where his warmest cloak hung by the door, and managed to wrap it around himself. Then, with Storm's help, He dragged himself outside into the snow. What followed was one of the most harrowing journeys in the history of the kingdom, though almost no one would ever know about it. Bjorn, 4 years old with paralyzed legs, pulled himself through the snow-covered forest, his arms doing all the work, his body leaving a trail through the white powder. Storm stayed by his side the whole time, lending his small strength when Bjorn needed to get over obstacles, sharing his warmth during rest breaks, and refusing to abandon his master no matter how impossible the journey seemed. They traveled all day, covering maybe 2 miles. Bjorn's hands were bloody and raw, his arms shaking with exhaustion, his body hypothermic, but he kept going. They slept that night in a small cave. Storm curled around Bjorn to keep him warm, both of them shivering through the bitter cold. When dawn came, Bjorn kept moving. The second day was harder. His strength was fading, his body approaching its limits. But in the afternoon they reached the main road, the one that led to the capital. And there, by the grace of whatever gods watch over desperate children, they encountered a merchant's caravan heading toward the city. The merchants were horrified to find a child alone in such a condition, and immediately brought Bjorn into one of their wagons. They gave him food and warmth, tended to his wounds as best they could, and promised to take him to the capital. When they asked where his parents were, Bjorn, with a determination that shocked these grown men, looked them in the eyes and said, "Take me to the Alpha King. He's my father, and he needs to know I'm hurt." The merchants exchanged glances, not sure whether to believe this extraordinary claim. But the boy had his mother's golden hair and honey-colored eyes, features that anyone in the kingdom would recognize from the portraits of the late Queen Astrid that still hung in public buildings. And there was something in the way he carried himself, even injured and desperate, that spoke of royal blood. So they took him to the capital. They bypassed all the normal protocols, drove their wagons directly to the gates of the castle, and demanded to see the king. The guards tried to turn them away, but the head merchant, a man named Gunnar who had daughters of his own, made such a scene that eventually word reached the great hall. That morning, King Halvard had been sitting in his throne room, reviewing reports of border disputes and resource allocations, the monotonous work of running a kingdom filling his days and keeping him from thinking too deeply about the emptiness of his nights. He hadn't smiled in 3 years, hadn't laughed, hadn't felt anything except the constant ache of loss that had become as familiar as breathing. His advisor, Magnus, a grizzled old warrior who had served 3 generations of kings, approached the throne with a troubled expression. "My king, there's a situation at the gates. A merchant caravan has brought a child who claims to be your son." Halvard's entire body went rigid. "I have no son." "With respect, my lord, you do," Magnus said carefully. "The boy in Ravendal is here. And according to the merchants, he's badly injured." For 3 years, Halvard had managed to avoid thinking about the child he'd sent away, the golden-haired boy with Astrid's eyes who represented everything he'd lost. He'd sent money regularly, ensured Ragna had everything she needed, but he'd never visited, never asked for updates, never acknowledged that somewhere in his kingdom lived a small piece of Astrid that still breathed. "Send him to the healers," Halvard said coldly, turning back to his papers. "If he's injured, they'll tend to him. Then arrange for his return to Ravendal." "Ragna is dead, my lord," Magnus said quietly. "She died 8 days ago. The boy has been alone. And his injury is serious. He can't walk." Something flickered across Halvard's face, too quick to identify. "Then find another caretaker. Someone in the village can." He didn't get to finish the sentence because at that moment, the massive oak doors to the great hall burst open, and a small figure came crawling through, dragging himself across the polished stone floor with bloody hands, a gray and white wolf pup running alongside him. "Alpha King!" the child screamed, his voice cracking with desperation and terror. "Please, please, Mommy can't stand up. She's on the floor and she won't move." The entire hall fell silent. Every guard, every advisor, every servant stopped and stared at this small boy pulling himself across the floor, his legs dragging uselessly behind him, his honey-colored eyes wild with fear and confusion, so lost in his trauma that he was conflating the memory of his mother's death with his own current paralysis. And Halvard, the Unbreakable King, the man who had shown no emotion for 3 years, looked at this child. His child, his son, his flesh and blood, and felt something crack deep inside his chest. Those were Astrid's eyes looking up at him with desperate hope. That was Astrid's golden hair, matted now with dirt and sweat. That was Astrid's fierce determination in the set of the boy's jaw, even as tears streamed down his face. "Please," Bjorn sobbed, still crawling forward, his small body trembling. "I tried to help her, I tried so hard, but I can't make her stand up. Can't fix it. Need you. I need my father. Please." Halvard stood from his throne, moving like a man in a dream. He descended the steps slowly, each one bringing him closer to the child he'd abandoned, the son he'd refused to acknowledge, the living embodiment of his greatest loss and his deepest shame. The entire court held its breath, waiting to see what the frozen king would do. When Halvard reached Bjorn, he looked down at this small, broken, desperate creature, and for the first time in 3 years, felt the ice around his heart begin to crack. Slowly, carefully, he knelt down on the cold stone floor, bringing himself to the child's level. "Bjorn," he said, his voice rough with emotions he'd thought long dead. The boy's honey-colored eyes widened. "You know my name." "Of course I know your name," Halvard said, each word feeling like he was pulling it from somewhere deep and painful. "You're my son. Then why did you send me away?" Bjorn asked the question every child of abandonment eventually asks. "Why didn't you want me?" Halvard had no good answer for that, no words that could justify or explain what he'd done. So instead he did the only thing he could do. He reached out and gathered his son into his arms, lifting him off the cold floor, cradling him against his chest the way he should have done the day the boy was born. Bjorn stiffened at first, not understanding, not trusting, years of abandonment making him wary of this sudden affection. But then Halvard pulled him closer, held him tighter, and the dam of emotion that both of them had been holding back for so long finally burst. Bjorn wrapped his small arms around his father's neck and sobbed. For Ragna, for his paralyzed legs, for his mother he never knew, for all the lonely years when he'd needed this exact embrace, and it hadn't been there. And Halvard, the Unbreakable King, held his son and felt the ice around his heart shatter completely. He'd thought that loving Bjorn would hurt, that seeing Astrid in their son's face would destroy him. And it did hurt. Gods, it hurt worse than any battle wound, worse than any loss he'd ever experienced. But underneath the pain was something else, something he'd forgotten could exist. Love. Pure, overwhelming, transformative love for this brave, broken little boy who had crawled through hell to reach him. "I've got you," Halvard whispered against Bjorn's golden hair, his voice breaking. "I've got you now, and I'm never letting you go. I'm so sorry, Bjorn. I'm so sorry." The court watched in stunned silence as their cold, distant king stood with his son in his arms and carried him toward the healing ward. His steps quick and purposeful, his silver eyes blazing with a protective ferocity that hadn't been seen in years. Storm, the wolf pup, followed close behind, and Magnus quickly dispatched guards to bring the royal healers immediately. The healing ward had been maintained in pristine condition despite Astrid's death, a shrine to her memory that no one had dared disturb. The rooms still smelled of the herbs she'd favored, her medical texts still lined the shelves, her innovations still guided the healers who worked there. Halvard carried Bjorn through those familiar halls, and each step felt like walking through his own past, confronting all the grief he'd been running from. Solveig, the head healer who had delivered Bjorn and watched Astrid die, rushed into the main treatment room, her weathered face showing shock at seeing the king carrying his son. "My lord, what's happened?" "He's hurt," Halvard said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "He can't move his legs. Fix him. Whatever it takes, whatever resources you need, just fix him." He laid Bjorn gently on the examination table, and for the first time since picking him up, he really looked at his son. The boy was malnourished, his small body showing the effects of weeks of inadequate care. His hands were torn and bloody from dragging himself through the snow. His clothes were threadbare and dirty. His eyes were ringed with dark circles from exhaustion and trauma. And his legs lay completely limp on the table, unresponsive to any attempt at movement. "What happened to him?" Solveig asked as she began her examination, her skilled hands gently probing for injuries. "He fell," Bjorn said quietly before Halvard could answer. "I hit my head on the table, and then my legs stopped working. I tried to make them move, but they wouldn't listen to me." Solveig's expression grew grave as she continued her examination. She tested reflexes, checked sensation, and evaluated the mobility of each joint. Halvard stood beside the table, his hand resting on Bjorn's shoulder, watching every movement with the intensity of a man whose entire world depended on what this healer would say. "The good news," Solveig finally said, "is that I can find evidence of nerve function. He has sensation in his legs, which means the spinal cord hasn't been completely severed. The paralysis appears to be caused by severe inflammation and swelling around the spinal column from the impact. His body went into a protective shutdown." "Can you fix it?" Halvard demanded. "I believe so," Solveig said carefully. "But it will take time. We'll need to use a combination of healing magic, herbal treatments, and physical therapy. The swelling needs to come down gradually, and then we'll need to retrain the neural pathways. It could take weeks, possibly months." "Then we start immediately," Halvard said. "Whatever you need, it's yours." Over the next several hours, Solveig and her team of healers worked on Bjorn. They used ancient healing magic passed down through generations, magic that Astrid herself had studied and refined. They prepared poultices and tinctures from rare herbs. They carefully manipulated the boy's spine, releasing pressure points and encouraging the body's natural healing response. And through it all, Halvard stayed by his son's side, holding his hand, offering comfort, being the father he should have been from the beginning. Bjorn, exhausted from his ordeal, eventually fell asleep under the healer's care. Once the boy was resting peacefully, Solveig pulled Halvard aside, her expression stern. "That child dragged himself through a winter forest for 3 days to reach you," she said quietly. "His hands are shredded, his body is hypothermic, and he's severely malnourished. Ragnar wrote to you multiple times in the months before her death, begging for additional support, warning you that her health was failing. You ignored every letter." Halvard's jaw clenched. "I know what I've done." "Do you?" Solveig challenged. "Because that boy in there should hate you. He should resent you with every fiber of his being. Instead, he crawled through hell just for the chance that you might help him. Do you understand what kind of courage that took? What kind of desperate love?" "I abandoned him," Halvard said, the words like acid in his mouth. "I was a coward who couldn't face my own pain, so I inflicted it on an innocent child. I know exactly what I am, Solveig. You don't need to tell me." "Then what are you going to do about it?" Solveig pressed. "Because if you send that boy away again once he's healed, if you break his heart a second time, I will personally see to it that the entire kingdom knows what kind of king you really are." "I'm not sending him away," Halvard said firmly. "He stays here. With me. Where he should have been all along." Solveig studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. Because Astrid died believing you would love that child. Don't make her sacrifice meaningless." Bjorn woke up in the softest bed he'd ever felt, in a room so large it could have fit his entire cottage from Ravendel. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating stone walls hung with tapestries depicting wolves and forests and stars. For a moment he thought he was dreaming. But then he tried to move his legs and remembered everything. The fall, the paralysis, the desperate journey, the Alpha King's face when he'd finally opened those great oak doors. "You're awake." Bjorn turned his head to find his father sitting in a chair beside the bed. Halvard looked different in the morning light. Older somehow, more human, with lines of worry etched around his eyes that made him seem less like the distant king from stories and more like an actual person. "Where am I?" Bjorn asked. "The royal chambers," Halvard said. "My chambers." I had them bring you here after the healers finished their initial treatment. Why? It was a simple question, but it held so much weight. Why was Bjorn in the king's personal chambers instead of a guest room? Why was Halvard sitting beside his bed instead of attending to royal duties? Why was any of this happening? Because you're my son, Halvard said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And I've already wasted 3 years of your life. I don't intend to waste any more. Bjorn studied his father's face, looking for lies or false promises, but all he saw was raw honesty and something that might have been regret. Ragna used to tell me stories about you, he said softly. She said you were brave and strong and that you loved my mother more than anything in the world. Halvard's expression cracked, pain flashing across his features. I did love her, more than life itself. Then why did you blame me? Bjorn asked, his honey-colored eyes filling with tears. Why did you send me away if it wasn't my fault she died? The question hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. Halvard stood and moved to the window, his back to his son. His shoulders tense with the weight of 3 years of grief and guilt and cowardice. I didn't blame you, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I blamed myself. Your mother was dying, and the healers said they could only save one of you. I chose you. She chose to give up her life so you could live. And I let her make that choice because I was too weak to lose her. He turned back to face Bjorn, and there were tears on the face of the Unbreakable King, something no one in the kingdom had ever seen. Every time I looked at you, I saw that choice. I saw her dying. I saw my failure as a mate, as a king, as a man. I couldn't face it, so I sent you away. I told myself it was to protect you, but the truth is I was protecting myself from the pain of remembering what I'd lost. That's not fair, Bjorn said, his small voice trembling with emotion. I lost her too. I never even got to meet her, and you took away the only parent I had left. You're right, Halvard said, moving back to the bed and kneeling beside it so he was at eye level with his son. It wasn't fair. Nothing about what I did was fair or right or excusable. I was selfish and cruel, and I hurt you in ways I may never be able to make right. But I'm asking you now, Bjorn, to give me a chance to try. Let me be your father. Let me prove that I can be the man your mother believed I was. Bjorn looked at this powerful king kneeling beside his bed, offering vulnerability and asking for forgiveness, and felt something shift inside his chest. He was only 4 years old, but he'd already learned that life was too short to hold on to anger, that people made mistakes, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was choose to forgive. Okay, he whispered. But you have to promise me something. Anything, Halvard said immediately. Promise me you'll tell me about her. About my mother. Everything. I want to know who she was, what she loved, what she dreamed about. Ragna told me stories, but I want to hear them from you. Halvard's silver eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened, they were filled with a bittersweet mixture of pain and love. I promise. I'll tell you everything. Even the things that hurt to remember. And promise me one more thing, Bjorn added, his small hand reaching out to grasp his father's much larger one. Promise me you won't send me away again. Even if it's hard. Even if it hurts. Promise me you'll keep me. I promise, Halvard said, his voice breaking as he squeezed his son's hand gently. You're staying right here with me where you belong. And anyone who tries to take you from me will have to go through the Unbreakable King first. For the first time since Ragna died, Bjorn smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it transformed his face, making him look like the child he was supposed to be instead of the traumatized orphan he'd become. And Halvard, looking at that smile, felt something he hadn't felt in 3 long years. Hope. The castle that had been cold and silent for 3 years suddenly came alive again. Not in the loud, celebratory way it had been during Astrid's time, but in a quieter, more intimate way that spoke of healing and new beginnings. Halvard's first act as a father was to move Bjorn into the chambers that had been prepared for him before he was born, the nursery that Astrid had designed with such love and care that Halvard had locked and refused to enter for 3 years. Opening those doors was one of the hardest things Halvard had ever done. The room was exactly as Astrid had left it. Walls painted with murals of forests and wolves, a crib carved with intricate designs, shelves ready for books and toys. The blanket Astrid had been embroidering laid carefully over the railing. Everything was covered in dust, frozen in time, a monument to dreams that had died the night she did. Was this for me? Bjorn asked in wonder as Halvard carried him into the room. His legs still weren't working, but Solveig had assured them that with continued treatment, there was an 80% chance he would walk again. Your mother designed it, Halvard said, his voice thick with emotion. She spent months planning every detail. She wanted you to grow up surrounded by beauty and love and magic. Bjorn looked around the room with wide eyes, taking in all the care that had gone into creating this space. She really wanted me, didn't she? She wanted you more than anything, Halvard confirmed. From the moment she found out she was carrying you, you were her whole world. She would talk to you constantly, tell you stories and sing to you. She'd place my hand on her belly so I could feel you moving. She was so excited to meet you. Tell me more, Bjorn said eagerly. What else did she do? And so began a new routine. Every night, after the healers had finished Bjorn's treatments, after dinner had been served and the kingdom had settled into sleep, Halvard would sit beside his son's bed and tell him stories about Astrid. He told him about how they met, about her stubborn insistence on becoming the royal healer despite her lack of noble blood. He told him about their first kiss under the northern lights, about the way she would laugh when she beat him at chess, about her terrible singing voice that she absolutely refused to be embarrassed about. He told Bjorn about Astrid's brilliance, how she'd revolutionized the healing ward with techniques she'd learned from ancient texts. He told him about her kindness, how she would sneak food to the poorest families in the kingdom, how she treated everyone from the highest noble to the lowest servant with the same respect and care. He told him about her fierce spirit, how she'd once punched a visiting alpha in the face for making a disrespectful comment about women, how she'd stood up to Halvard himself when she thought he was making a bad decision. She sounds perfect, Bjorn said one night after a particularly detailed story about Astrid negotiating a peace treaty between two warring packs. She wasn't perfect, Halvard corrected gently. She was stubborn as a mule and had a temper that could make grown men cry. She held grudges and sometimes made impulsive decisions. But she was real and she was brave and she loved with her whole heart. That's what made her special. I wish I could have known her, Bjorn said sadly. You do know her, Halvard said, touching his son's chest right over his heart. She's in here. Every time you show kindness to someone, that's your mother. Every time you fight for what's right, even when it's hard, that's your mother. Every time you refuse to give up, that's your mother. She lives in you, Bjorn. And as long as you're alive, a part of her is too. These conversations did something unexpected for Halvard. He'd thought that talking about Astrid would make the grief worse, would tear open wounds that had barely begun to scab over. Instead, he found that sharing her memory with their son actually helped. It transformed his grief from a sharp, angry thing into something softer, something that could coexist with joy and hope. He was learning that loving someone who was gone didn't mean forgetting them or moving on from them. It meant carrying them forward, keeping their memory alive, and honoring their legacy by living the life they would have wanted for you. During the days, Halvard began the difficult process of learning how to be a father. It didn't come naturally to him. He was used to commanding armies, making strategic decisions, inspiring fear and respect. But Bjorn didn't need a king. He needed a dad. Someone to play with, to laugh with, to make him feel safe and loved. So Halvard, the most powerful alpha in the northern kingdoms, learned how to tell silly jokes that made his son giggle. He learned how to make funny faces that chased away nightmares. He learned how to braid golden hair the way Ragnar used to, though his first attempts were so terrible that even Bjorn had to laugh. He learned to read bedtime stories with different voices for each character. He learned to sit through long, rambling tales about Storm's adventures in the castle. He learned to give hugs that said, "I love you," even when words felt inadequate. And slowly, day by day, The frozen wall around his heart melted completely. He discovered that he could love Bjorn without it destroying him, that joy and grief could exist in the same space, that moving forward didn't mean betraying Astrid's memory. It meant honoring it. The healing process was slow but steady. Solveig and her team worked tirelessly on Bjorn's legs, using every technique in their considerable arsenal. They used healing magic that made the boy's skin glow with soft light. They prepared special teas that tasted terrible but helped reduce inflammation. They performed gentle manipulations that encouraged the nerves to reconnect and function properly. And most importantly, they began physical therapy sessions that were exhausting and often painful but absolutely necessary. Bjorn approached his recovery with the same determination he'd shown when dragging himself through the forest. Even when the exercises hurt, even when progress seemed impossibly slow, he never complained, never gave up, never lost hope. Halvard attended every therapy session, encouraging his son, celebrating small victories, and offering comfort during setbacks. "You're like your mother," Halvard told Bjorn one day after a particularly difficult session that had left the boy exhausted and frustrated. "She never knew when to quit either." "Is that a good thing?" Bjorn asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's the best thing," Halvard assured him. "That determination, that refusal to accept defeat, that's what makes you special. That's what will make you a great man someday." 3 weeks after arriving at the castle, Bjorn experienced his first breakthrough. During a therapy session, while Solveig was working on his left leg, his toes moved. It was barely perceptible, just the slightest twitch, but it was movement, voluntary controlled movement. "Did you see that?" Bjorn shouted, his eyes wide with excitement. "My toes moved. I made them move." Solveig's weathered face broke into the biggest smile Halvard had seen in years. "You certainly did, young prince. That's excellent progress." Halvard, who had been standing in the corner trying not to hover, crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled his son into a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So incredibly proud." From that day forward, progress accelerated. The toes twitching became ankle movement. Ankle movement became knee flexion. Knee flexion became hip mobility. It was still weeks before Bjorn could stand on his own, and even longer before he could walk, but every small victory was celebrated like a major triumph. During this time, the relationship between father and son deepened in ways that surprised them both. They discovered shared interests. Both loved history and strategy games. They had similar senses of humor. Both found Storm's habit of stealing socks from servants absolutely hilarious. They even shared some of the same fears. Both had nightmares about loss and abandonment, though they came from different places. Halvard also began introducing Bjorn to life in the castle beyond the healing ward. He brought his son to council meetings, letting him observe how a kingdom was run. Bjorn would sit quietly in the corner with Storm, listening to debates about resource allocation and border disputes, absorbing everything with the sharp intelligence he'd inherited from his mother. Sometimes he would ask questions afterward that made Halvard rethink his positions. His childish perspective cutting through political complexity to the heart of issues. "Why don't we just ask the farmers what they need instead of guessing?" Bjorn asked one day after a long meeting about agricultural policy. It was such a simple, obvious suggestion that Halvard was embarrassed he hadn't thought of it himself. The next week, he implemented a new policy allowing farmers to petition the throne directly with their concerns. It improved relations with the agricultural communities immensely and resulted in better, more informed decisions. "You're already making this kingdom better," Halvard told his son. "Your mother would be so proud." The castle staff, who had grown accustomed to their cold, distant king, were shocked by the transformation. Halvard smiled now. He laughed. He played with his son in the corridors, chasing him in his wheeled chair that the craftsman had built, making Storm bark with excitement as they raced through the halls. He attended dinners in the great hall instead of eating alone in his chambers. He was more patient in council meetings, more thoughtful in his decisions, and more connected to his people. "It's like having the old king back," Magnus commented one evening. The one who ruled before the tragedy. Except better somehow. More grounded. Bjorn saved him, Solveig said wisely. Just like Astrid would have wanted. That boy gave Halvard a reason to live again, to love again, to be human again. But not everyone was happy about the changes. There were nobles who had benefited from Halvard's grief-stricken isolation, who had gained power and influence in the vacuum his emotional absence had created. There were advisors who preferred a king focused solely on military strength and territorial expansion, rather than one who worried about farmers' needs and his son's happiness. And there were those who simply couldn't accept that a low-born child, the son of a baker's daughter, should be heir to the throne. The opposition was led by Jarl Finn, a nobleman whose family had lost significant influence when Astrid became queen. He was careful, subtle in his machinations, never openly challenging the king but constantly working behind the scenes to undermine Bjorn's position. "The boy is weak," Finn would whisper in council meetings when Halvard wasn't present. "He can't even walk. How can such a child lead warriors? How can he defend the kingdom? He's 4 years old and recovering from a serious injury," Magnus would counter. "Give the boy time. Time won't change his blood," Finn would reply. "He's half commoner. The throne deserves better." These whispers eventually reached Halvard's ears, and he responded with characteristic decisiveness. He called a full assembly of the court, requiring every noble, every advisor, every person of influence to attend. When they were all gathered in the great hall, he had Bjorn brought in, carrying his son in his arms, and placed him on a specially modified throne that had been built at child height beside his own. "Let me be absolutely clear," Halvard announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Bjorn is my son, my heir, and the future of this kingdom. Anyone who questions this, anyone who undermines him, anyone who spreads poison about his worth will answer to me personally. And I promise you, that is not a conversation you want to have." The silver eyes that had earned him the name Unbreakable swept across the assembled nobles, and many of them lowered their gazes, unable to meet that intense stare. Finn, however, was foolish enough to speak up. "With respect, my king, the boy cannot even walk." "How can he? My son dragged himself through 3 days of winter forest with paralyzed legs to reach me," Halvard interrupted, his voice cold enough to freeze fire. "He showed more courage in those 3 days than you've shown in your entire life, Finn. And he's only 4 years old. Imagine what he'll be capable of when he's grown." "But his bloodline," Finn tried again. "His bloodline." Halvard's laugh was harsh. "He carries the blood of Astrid Bjornsdottir, the most brilliant, courageous, compassionate leader this kingdom has ever known. He carries my blood, the line of warriors and kings. But more importantly, he carries himself with honor and determination that most of you could never match. His worth isn't determined by whose daughter his mother was. It's determined by his own character, his own choices, his own strength." Halvard stood, his imposing figure making even the bravest nobles take a step back. "I made a mistake 3 years ago. I let my grief cloud my judgment, and I abandoned my son when he needed me most. Failed him. I failed Astrid. And I failed this kingdom by denying you the chance to know this remarkable child. But I'm correcting that mistake now, and I will not tolerate anyone else making my son feel unwanted or less than. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, my king" echoed through the hall, though Halvard could hear the reluctance in some voices. But he didn't care about their enthusiasm. He only cared about their compliance. Bjorn, sitting in his small throne, had watched this entire exchange with wide eyes. When Halvard sat back down, the boy reached over and took his father's hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," Bjorn whispered. "Always," Halvard whispered back. "I will always fight for you." From that day forward, the opposition to Bjorn's position as heir went underground. Finn and his allies still harbored their resentment, still plotted in shadows, but they no longer dared to speak openly against the young prince. And as weeks turned into months, as Bjorn's recovery progressed and his presence in the castle became normal, even the most skeptical nobles began to see what Halvard already knew. This child was special. Bjorn had inherited his mother's gift for connecting with people. Despite everything he'd been through, despite the abandonment and pain and loss, he remained kind and open-hearted. He would spend hours with the servants' children, playing games and telling stories. He would visit the healing ward to encourage other patients going through difficult recoveries. He would ask the guards about their families, the cooks about their recipes, the stable hands about their horses. He treated everyone with genuine interest and respect, never pulling rank or acting superior. "He's just like his mother," the older servants would say with tears in their eyes. The same gentle spirit, the same generous heart. For months after Bjorn's dramatic arrival at the castle came the day everyone had been waiting for. During his therapy session, while Solveig worked with him on standing exercises, Bjorn suddenly pushed himself fully upright without assistance. He stood there, swaying slightly but balanced, his legs trembling from the effort but holding his weight. "I'm standing," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I'm actually standing." "You are indeed, young prince," Solveig said, tears streaming down her face. "You've done it." Halvard, who had been in a council meeting when word reached him, abandoned the entire assembly and ran to the healing ward. He arrived to find his son standing on his own 2 feet, supported only by Solveig's steadying hands on his shoulders, grinning so wide it looked like his face might split in half. "Father, I'm standing." Halvard crossed the room and knelt in front of his son, bringing them eye to eye. "You're standing," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the bravest person I've ever known, Bjorn. Your mother would be so proud." "Do you think she can see me?" Bjorn asked. "Wherever she is." "I know she can," Halvard said with absolute certainty. "And she's probably up there bragging to everyone about what an incredible son she has." Within a week, Bjorn was taking his first tentative steps. Within 2 weeks, he was walking short distances without assistance. Within a month, he was running through the castle corridors with Storm chasing after him, his laughter echoing off stone walls that hadn't heard such joyful sounds in years. The kingdom celebrated the young prince's recovery as if it were a national holiday. Nobles who had questioned his worth now sent gifts and congratulations. Commoners who had heard stories of the brave little boy who couldn't be broken considered him a hero. And Halvard, watching his son race through the castle with all the energy of a normal 4-year-old, felt his heart fully heal for the first time since Astrid died. But life, as Halvard had learned, is never simple. Just as everything seemed to be falling into place, a new challenge emerged. Word reached the castle that a pack of rogues had been attacking villages near the eastern border, and they needed to be dealt with swiftly and decisively. As Alpha King, Halvard's presence was required to lead the response. It would mean leaving the castle for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. The old Halvard would have left without a second thought, confident in his warriors and focused solely on the mission. But the new Halvard, the father Halvard, found himself torn. He'd just gotten his son back. Bjorn had just recovered from a devastating injury. How could he leave now? "You have to go," Bjorn said when Halvard explained the situation. They were sitting in the gardens, watching Storm chase butterflies. "The people need their king." "I don't want to leave you," Halvard admitted. "Not when we've only just found each other." "You're not leaving me," Bjorn said wisely. "You're going to protect the kingdom. That's what kings do. That's what fathers do. They keep their families safe, even when it's hard." Halvard looked at his son with amazement. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Bjorn said, leaning against his father's side. "Ragna used to tell me that being brave doesn't mean being scared. It means doing what needs to be done even when you are scared." "Your mother said something similar once," Halvard remembered. "She said courage is just love in action." "Then go show your courage," Bjorn said. "I'll be here when you get back. I promise." So Halvard prepared to leave, but not before taking every possible precaution. He increased the guard around Bjorn's chambers. He instructed Solveig and Magnus to watch over his son as if their lives depended on it. He made Bjorn promise to stay inside the castle walls, not to take unnecessary risks, and to send word immediately if anything felt wrong. "I'll be fine, father," Bjorn assured him. "Storm will protect me, and I have Solveig and Magnus and all the guards. Nothing bad will happen." But something did happen. 3 days after Halvard left, Bjorn woke in the middle of the night to Storm growling low in his throat, a sound the pup only made when he sensed danger. Bjorn sat up in bed, his heart pounding, straining to hear what had alarmed his companion. Voices. Hushed, angry voices coming from the corridor outside his chambers. Bjorn slipped out of bed quietly, Storm padding silently beside him, and crept to the door to listen. "Tonight while the king is gone. The boy is the problem. Remove him, and everything goes back to the way it should be. Make it look like an accident. The healing ward is full of dangerous medicines." Bjorn's blood ran cold as he realized what he was hearing. Someone was planning to hurt him, to kill him, and they were going to do it tonight. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. He was alone, his father was days away, and assassins were literally outside his door. But then he remembered all the stories about his mother, about her courage in impossible situations. He remembered his father's words, "You're the bravest person I've ever known." And he remembered his own journey through the forest, how he'd refused to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. He couldn't fight trained assassins, but he could be smart, he could survive. Moving quickly and quietly, Bjorn went to the window of his chambers. They were on the second floor, too high to jump safely, but there was a sturdy vine growing up the wall, the same one his mother had supposedly planted years ago. Bjorn had climbed trees in Ravendal. He could climb this. He tied his small dagger to his belt, the one Halvard had given him the week before, whistled softly for Storm and climbed out the window. The vine held his weight, and he descended carefully, Storm somehow managing to climb down after him with the agility only young wolves possess. Once on the ground, Bjorn ran. He knew the castle grounds well enough by now to navigate in the dark, and he made his way to the stables where Magnus kept his personal horses. If he could reach Magnus, if he could warn someone, maybe he could stop whatever was about to happen. But he never made it to the stables. A hand clamped over his mouth from behind, and he was lifted off the ground, Storm's warning bark cut short by another attacker. Bjorn bit down hard on the hand covering his mouth, tasting blood, but his small teeth couldn't do enough damage to free him. "Got the little prince," a rough voice said. It was Dagny, one of Finn's personal guards. "What should we do with him?" "Take him to the old tower," another voice responded. Bjorn recognized it as Finn himself. "We'll deal with him there, away from prying eyes." They carried Bjorn through the castle grounds, Storm following desperately, barking and growling, but unable to help. They reached the abandoned tower on the far edge of the castle complex, a crumbling structure that hadn't been used in decades. They took him up the winding stairs to a room at the top and threw him roughly onto the stone floor. Bjorn scrambled to his feet, his hand going to the dagger at his belt. He might be small, he might only be 4 years old, but he was Astrid's son and Halvard's heir, and he would not go down without a fight. "Stay back," he warned, holding the dagger in front of him with shaking hands. Storm positioned himself between Bjorn and the attackers, growling with all the ferocity his small body could muster. Finn laughed, a cruel sound that echoed off the stone walls. "The little prince wants to fight. How adorable. Just like his commoner mother. Brave but ultimately useless." "Don't you dare talk about my mother," Bjorn said, his voice stronger than he felt. "She was worth 100 of you. She was a baker's daughter who got lucky," Finn sneered. "And now her mongrel son thinks he deserves a throne. This kingdom needs strong leadership, not weak-blooded children who can barely walk." "I can walk just fine," Bjorn said, adjusting his stance to prove it. "And when my father gets back, he's going to destroy you for this." "Your father won't be coming back," Finn said with satisfaction. I sent him into an ambush. Even the Unbreakable King can't survive 50 rogues attacking at once. By morning we'll have news of his tragic death, and with both king and heir gone, the throne will pass to someone worthy. Bjorn felt like the world had dropped out from beneath him. His father who had just learned to love him, who had just started being a real family with him, was in danger because of these monsters. Rage, unlike anything he'd ever felt, burned through his veins, hot and bright and demanding action. You're wrong, Bjorn said, and something in his voice made even Finn pause. My father is the Unbreakable King. He survived losing my mother. He survived 3 years of grief that would have destroyed a lesser man. He crawled back from darkness itself to be my father. Your pathetic ambush won't stop him. Nothing will stop him. And then Bjorn did something that no one expected, something that proved beyond any doubt whose son he was. He threw his head back and howled. Not a human cry, but a true wolf's howl, the kind that carries for miles, the kind that summons the pack, the kind that says, I am here and I need help. Storm joined in, his puppy voice adding to the call, and together they created a sound that pierced the night, echoing across the castle grounds and out into the forest beyond. It was a desperate gamble. Bjorn had no way of knowing if anyone would hear, if anyone would understand, if anyone would come. But he had to try. Finn moved forward, angry now, raising his hand to strike the boy. But before he could reach Bjorn, the door to the tower room exploded inward, torn off its hinges by a force that shook the entire structure. Magnus stood in the doorway, his sword drawn, his eyes blazing with protective fury. Behind him were a dozen royal guards, all armed and ready for battle. Step away from the prince, Magnus growled, or I will personally ensure your death is neither quick nor painless. Finn and his conspirators were trapped, caught between Magnus' warriors and their own guilty consciences. They tried to fight, but the battle was over before it truly began. Magnus was a legendary warrior for a reason, and with the element of surprise gone, the conspirators stood no chance. Within minutes, Finn and his men were disarmed and restrained, being dragged away to the dungeons. Magnus crossed to Bjorn and knelt down, his weathered face full of concern. Are you hurt, young prince? I'm okay, Bjorn said, though he was shaking now that the danger had passed. But my father, Finn said he sent him into an ambush. We have to warn him. Magnus' expression hardened. I'll send our fastest riders immediately. But first, let's get you somewhere safe. The howl, one of the guards said wonderingly. We heard the howl and knew someone was in trouble. How did you learn to call like that, my prince? Bjorn looked down at Storm, who wagged his tail proudly. My mother's blood, I guess. She was a wolf through and through, even if she was born in a baker's kitchen. The next few hours were chaos. Riders were dispatched to warn Halvard about the ambush. The castle was locked down as guards searched for any remaining conspirators. Finn and his allies were interrogated, revealing the full extent of their plot. It turned out the rogues attacking the eastern border had been hired by Finn specifically to lure Halvard away from the castle. The ambush had been carefully planned, with 50 mercenary wolves positioned along the king's route. But Finn had underestimated 2 crucial things: Halvard's skill as a warrior and Bjorn's ability to survive. The warning reached the king's party just hours before they would have ridden into the trap. Halvard, alerted to the danger, reversed course and led his warriors in a devastating counterattack that caught the ambushers completely off guard. By the time the Unbreakable King returned to the castle 3 days later, every conspirator was either dead or in chains. He rode through the gates at full gallop, leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped, and running through the castle calling his son's name. Bjorn! Bjorn! He found his son in the great hall, sitting with Magnus and Solveig, Storm curled at his feet. The moment Bjorn saw his father, he launched himself forward, running into Halvard's arms with all the force his small body could generate. Father! You're alive! You're really alive! Halvard caught his son and held him so tightly it probably hurt, but Bjorn didn't complain. He just buried his face in his father's chest and cried, for the fear he'd felt, for the danger they'd both been in, for the relief of being together again. "I'm here," Halvard murmured into his son's golden hair. "I'm here and you're safe, and nothing is ever going to separate us again. Promise you, Bjorn. Never again." "Finn tried to kill me," Bjorn said, his voice muffled against Halvard's chest. "He said terrible things about Mother. He said I wasn't worthy of being heir because of her blood." Halvard's arms tightened around his son, and his silver eyes went cold with fury. "Where is he?" "The dungeons," Magnus supplied. "Awaiting your judgment, my king." "Good," Halvard said darkly. Then he pulled back slightly to look at his son, his hands cupping Bjorn's face gently. "Listen to me, Bjorn. Your mother's blood is the most precious thing flowing through your veins. She was brave and brilliant and beautiful, and you carry all of that inside you. Anyone who thinks her blood makes you less is a fool who doesn't deserve the air they breathe." "That's what I told Finn," Bjorn said with a watery smile. "Right before I howled for help." "You howled?" Halvard's eyebrows rose with surprise and pride. "A true wolf's howl." "Storm helped," Bjorn admitted. "But yes, it was the only thing I could think of to call for help." Halvard laughed, a sound of pure joy and relief, and pulled his son close again. "That's my boy. That's Astrid's son. Brave and clever and absolutely unstoppable." That night, after Bjorn had been checked by healers and fed and tucked into bed, Halvard went to the dungeons to deal with Finn. The man who had tried to kill his son was chained to the wall, bruised and defeated, all his arrogance stripped away. "Any last words?" Halvard asked coldly. "The boy will never be accepted," Finn spat. "His blood is tainted. The nobles will never truly follow him." "Then the nobles are welcome to challenge me," Halvard said. "And I will defeat them, just as I've defeated every other threat to my family. My son is heir to this throne, and anyone who disagrees will learn exactly why they call me unbreakable." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "You said my mate was useless, that her blood made our son weak. But she died defeating Dagmar, one of the strongest warriors in this kingdom, while 3 months pregnant and armed with nothing but her healer's knowledge. She faced death with courage that made even her killers respect her. And her son, at 4 years old, survived assassins, warned the kingdom, and saved my life with his quick thinking. So you tell me, Finn, who's really weak here? The boy with common blood who has more courage in his little finger than you've shown in your entire life? Or the nobleman with pure blood who cowers in chains, defeated by a child?" Halvard left Finn in the dungeons to contemplate his failures and went back to his son. He found Bjorn still awake, sitting up in bed with Storm beside him. "Can't sleep?" Halvard asked gently. "I keep thinking about what Finn said," Bjorn admitted. "About the nobles never accepting me. What if he's right? What if I can never be a good king because of who my mother was?" Halvard sat on the edge of the bed and took his son's small hands in his own large ones. "Do you know what makes a good king, Bjorn? It's not bloodline or noble ancestry. It's character. It's the ability to love your people and put their needs above your own. It's the courage to make hard decisions and stand by them. It's the wisdom to listen to advice but the strength to lead when necessary. Your mother had all of those qualities, and so do you." "Really?" Bjorn asked hopefully. "Really," Halvard confirmed. "In 4 years of life, you've already shown more courage, more compassion, and more determination than most adults display in a lifetime. You dragged yourself through a winter forest when you couldn't walk. You survived an assassination attempt and saved my life. You treat everyone with kindness and respect, regardless of their station. You're going to be an incredible king someday, Bjorn. Not despite your mother's blood, but because of it." Bjorn thought about this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm going to make you proud. Both of you." "You already have," Halvard said, kissing his son's forehead. "Every single day you make us proud." 5 years passed. Bjorn grew from a small, traumatized 4-year-old into a confident, compassionate 9-year-old who was loved throughout the kingdom. He trained with weapons under his father's guidance, showing natural talent for strategy and combat. He studied healing arts from Solveig, honoring his mother's legacy. He learned diplomacy and governance from Magnus, proving to be a quick study with excellent instincts. And he spent hours in the villages and towns of the kingdom, getting to know his future subjects, understanding their needs, earning their loyalty. The nobles who had once questioned his right to rule became his most ardent supporters. They saw that this boy had something rare and precious, the warrior spirit of his father combined with the compassionate heart of his mother. He could negotiate peace treaties in the morning and win sparring matches in the afternoon. He could diagnose illnesses and command respect from seasoned soldiers. He was everything a future king should be. Halvard watched his son grow with pride that bordered on awe. The little boy who had crawled through his doors crying for help had become a remarkable young man who would one day lead the kingdom to greatness. And every day, Halvard thanked the gods for that desperate morning when Bjorn's cry had shattered his frozen heart and brought him back to life. On the anniversary of Astrid's death, Halvard and Bjorn made a tradition of walking to a clearing in the forest where they'd planted a special tree in her memory. It was a golden oak, rare and beautiful, its leaves shimmering in the sunlight just like Astrid's hair used to. "Do you think she'd be happy?" Bjorn asked during one such visit. He was 9 now, his golden hair longer, his honey-colored eyes wise beyond his years. With how things turned out, Halvard looked at his son, tall for his age, strong, confident, kind, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I think she'd be overjoyed. You're everything she hoped you'd be and more." "And you?" Bjorn asked. "Are you happy, father?" It was a simple question, but it carried weight. 5 years ago, Halvard would have said happiness was impossible, that he'd never feel joy again after losing Astrid. But standing here in the forest with his son, feeling the sun on his face and love in his heart, he realized that grief and happiness weren't mutually exclusive. He could miss Astrid with every breath and still find joy in raising their son. He could honor her memory and still move forward with his life. "I am happy," he said honestly. "I carry sadness for what we lost, but I have gratitude for what we gained. Your mother gave us the greatest gift. She gave me you. And every day with you is a blessing I don't take for granted." Bjorn smiled, that bright, warm smile that reminded Halvard so much of Astrid. "I'm glad I came to find you that day. Even though it was scary. Even though I didn't know if you'd want me." "I always wanted you," Halvard said, pulling his son close. "I was just too broken to see it. But you fixed me, Bjorn. You saved me just as much as I saved you." Storm, now a full-grown wolf, padded over and nuzzled both of them, his tail wagging. The 3 of them stood together in the clearing, under the golden oak that grew stronger and more beautiful each year, a living testament to a love that had conquered death, to a sacrifice that had created life, and to a family that had been shattered and rebuilt into something even stronger. As they turned to walk back to the castle, Bjorn suddenly stopped and looked back at the tree. "I can feel her sometimes, you know. When I'm healing someone or standing up for what's right. It's like she's right there with me, guiding my hands, giving me courage." "She is with you," Halvard said. "She's in every kind word you speak, every brave action you take, every life you touch. Your mother lives on through you, Bjorn. And because of you, she'll never truly be gone." They walked back together through the forest, father and son, king and heir, 2 souls who had found each other in the darkest of times and built something beautiful from the ruins of tragedy. The kingdom of Nordskog would flourish under their combined leadership, and one day, when Bjorn took the throne, he would rule with a perfect balance of strength and compassion, of warrior spirit and healer's heart. The story of the little boy who crawled to the Alpha King, crying for help, would be told for generations. But the real story was even better. It was about a broken king who learned to love again, about a child who refused to give up, about a woman whose sacrifice continued to shape the world long after her death, and about a family that proved love was stronger than grief, hope more powerful than despair, and courage the greatest gift you could give your children. Years later, when Bjorn was crowned king at age 25, He wore his mother's golden locket around his neck. During his coronation speech, he spoke of her legacy, of her courage, of the debt the kingdom owed to a baker's daughter who had changed everything. "My mother taught us that true nobility comes from character, not bloodline," King Bjorn said to the assembled crowd. "She taught us that love is the greatest power in the universe. And she taught us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sacrifice yourself so others can live. I pledge to rule with her wisdom, her compassion, and her unwavering commitment to justice. For her, for my father who taught me strength, and for all of you my people, whom I will serve with everything I am." The crowd roared with approval, and somewhere in the spirit realm, Astrid Bjornsdottir smiled, knowing that her choice that terrible night had been worth it. Her son had become the king she'd always known he could be. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. And in the royal box, Halvard, now in his 50s with silver hair and a face lined by both grief and joy, watched his son with tears streaming down his face. He thought about that morning 5 years ago when Bjorn had crawled through his doors, breaking through the ice around his heart. He thought about Astrid and the life they'd built together. He thought about all the joy and pain and love that had brought them to this moment. "We did it, little light," he whispered to the wind, knowing somehow that she could hear him. "Our son is everything you believed he would be. You'd be so proud." And as the new young king embraced his father on the steps of the throne, as storm howled his approval to the sky, as the kingdom celebrated the beginning of a new era, everyone present knew they were witnessing something special. Not just the crowning of a king, but the culmination of a love story that had transcended death itself. The little boy who couldn't stand had grown into a man who would stand for his people. The Alpha King who had been broken had healed. And the queen who had died giving life continued to shape the world through the son she'd chosen, the mate she'd loved, and the legacy she'd left behind. That's where our story ends, but for Bjorn and Halvard, it was really just the beginning. The best chapters of their lives were still ahead of them, written in the love they shared, the kingdom they protected, and the memory of a brave woman who had shown them all what it meant to truly live. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the pain and triumph of this journey, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who's struggling to forgive. Share it with someone who's lost and needs to remember that love can heal even the deepest wounds. And tell me in the comments what moment hit you hardest. Was it Bjorn's desperate crawl to the castle? Halvard's breakdown when he finally held his son? Or the moment they both learned to live again? Remember, family isn't just about blood or biology. It's about choosing to show up, to fight for each other, to love through the hard times. It's about second chances and forgiveness and having the courage to try again even when you're terrified of being hurt. The Alpha King learned that lesson when his pup ran to him, crying for help. And in saving his son, he